Welcome back to the Blackletter podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to another edition of the Blackletter podcast. With me once again is Ryan Kennedy. Ryan is here to talk about real estate and real property law and hot topics. And so the first hot topic, Ryan, thanks for coming back, is the settlement between NAR and that class action suit. So recently, the National Association of Realtors was involved in a class action lawsuit for, I think, a lot of money.
A fair amount of money.
Yeah, I can't remember. Do you remember how much it was?
I don't remember.
Hundreds of millions they wanted, at least. Yeah.
All of it, all the money.
Yeah. So, but they settled, and the settlement had some requirements. So tell us about that lawsuit. Tell us what happened there.
Sure. So, and I should say that the settlement isn't exclusive to every single player in the real estate industry. There were certain defendants that settled, that signed the settlement agreement. And I think there are still some defendants who are continuing forward, and we don't know what will happen.
But NAR is the big one.
NAR is the big one. And
that's the dog as opposed to the tail.
That's one way to say it. Yes. The issue with the NAR settlement is that the offer of cooperative compensation on the MLS is no longer.
Okay, so explain the offer of cooperative compensation and what that has been since time immemorial in the United States real estate world. What is that?
So property's up for sale. The seller signs an agreement with their broker. They agree to pay, say, 6%. You often hear that percentage. And as a sort of just a matter of custom, it has developed over time that the listing broker will say to the buyer's broker, an agent, I will offer 2%, 3%.
It's typically half, right?
Or half, some percentage cooperative compensation so that at the closing table, both the agents get paid.
Right.
And it all sort of comes from the same pot, so to speak.
So in turn, from what I understand from the lawsuit, that drove the cost, according to the suit, of housing up because you really didn't have a choice. You were paying a listing agent and you were paying a buyer's agent every single time if you were listing your house. So if you wanted to sell your house for $100,000, you had to get $106,000 at least if you wanted $100,000 every time, because that's pretty much what happens all the time. At least that's what I understand from the complaint.
That was the theory, at least, is that it was it was a bad incentive for buyers and sellers. So the settlement basically says that conversation no longer happens on the front end. You won't find in a listing an offer of compensation to the buyer's agent. So there's been a lot, and the agents that we talk to, the brokers that we've been talking to, there's really still a lot of dust settling as to what this
You represent
means.
One of the largest real estate groups in the DC metro area.
We represent a couple large ones. Some of them maybe not large enough to be part of the settlement agreement, but all of them are ultimately affected by it.
Right.
Because
they're stuck with this rule?
They're either stuck with how the MLS is going to work.
I see.
Or because there's trepidation over other entrepreneurial plaintiffs' attorneys.
They will sue them.
They'll sue them anyways.
Okay. Yeah. So do you think, though, that it's really going to change that much about how agents are paid?
There's still a lot of dust settling. I should say that up front. But I think ultimately there will still be agents getting paid. The conversation is no longer this upfront offer of cooperative compensation, but it can still occur as a negotiated compensation on the back end of a deal.
So let me ask you this, though, just devil's advocate. What motivates the buyer's agent what motivates the listing agent after the buyer's agent's brought a seller to give that buyer's agent anything? Is it the promise of bringing the next seller? Because on that deal, technically, legally, since there's no cooperative compensation offer, the listing agent and the owner of the home can say, too bad. I'm paying all 6%, or I've negotiated it down to 5% since you don't have to pay that guy anymore. So is that going to push commissions down, do you think?
I don't know whether to push commissions down. I think the seller will be less
have more
inclined.
Control.
Well, they'll be less inclined to pay a 6% to a seller's agent if they know that
there's no cooperative.
If there's no cooperative, and the seller's agent's not taking actually 3%, now they're actually taking 6%. That's an awkward conversation.
Okay, so tell me now, how do you think it'll work on the back end then?
Well, I don't know how it'll work. Brokers and buyer's agents are working on different language for
let me ask this question.
Buyer agreements.
Aren't listing agents and buyer's agents usually the same people? In other words, I'm a buyer's agent, but I also have listings. Is that typical or no? Is the real estate really, is the market segregated where you have people who are mostly buyer's agents? I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean that's all. Yeah, no, no one's just a buyer's agent or just a seller's agent.
They want listings.
Yeah, they want
because listings now in this new world, they guarantee you a commission. Being a buyer's agent, you're not necessarily guaranteed a commission, technically.
Well, you still have the opportunity to negotiate with your buyer and have a buyer's agreement, a rep agreement that sets forth how you will be compensated.
You told me about before this podcast, we were chatting, and you said apparently state and local governments that assess homes for property tax or look at permitting are using Zillow and Redfin, these public listings, these real estate listings, to determine whether or not somebody has a legal permit when they sell their home. What are the consequences of that? And well, tell me the whole thing. Tell me what's going on.
Well, yeah, local governments, we've encountered a number of cases where local governments are using someone's beautiful pictures on Redfin or Zillow to say, well, a couple of different things. One you alluded to is, hey, you've made a lot of improvements. We think your property value is a lot higher than we said it was. So here's some additional taxes.
Great. And people don't want that.
No, that's never well received. Or, hey, you moved a wall. You put in a deck. You built a kitchenette. You didn't get a permit.
Right.
We can see it right there. We don't see a permit in our system. And so the consequence of that is a new home buyer is in their house for a couple weeks, and local government comes, issues a citation because you've got an unpermitted deck. They'll also probably issue a citation to the seller. We've represented people on both sides.
Really? So after it's sold, the seller can get a citation?
Yeah. So we've represented people who've perhaps flipped a property and they didn't get the correct permits, or they got no permits.
So what's the solution? I mean, do they make you tear the deck off or tear out the kitchenette, or is there another solution that you've helped with?
The solution is to try to convince the county to avoid that, because a lot of times the county or the local government will want to say, well, you've got to take down the drywall, we've got to see the framing, we've got to pull the deck apart because we have to know the ledger board's in there correctly. But you got to get ahead of that issue. You've got probably to hire your own contractor to come in and look things over, and becomes a conversation. Ideally with the county that says, hey, I've reviewed pictures, I've reviewed this work. You don't have to rip off the drywall. We don't have to rip off the deck.
Question for you. If I'm a home buyer, would it behoove me to ask my home inspector, and I understand home inspectors don't typically do this, to check the permits on the things they see, to pull the permits for the house? Is there a way for somebody to do that?
It depends on where you are. Some places are more accessible than others. I think it's smart to look if you see that there's been work done, if you're aware that there's been work done recently in the property, is to look to see was their permits pulled, if you think that's something that a permit needs to be pulled for.
And if they weren't, then you can negotiate the price of the home down at a minimum or get an exception.
Yeah, or escrow some money to allow you to deal with that issue.
I like that.
And the ability to do that, some places have, it's all available online. You can type in the address and you get your results. Some places you are a little more remote.
And you have to go into the permitting office. Yeah, that's right. That's no fun. So, Ryan, those are two great issues. When you come back next time, I'm going to challenge you to share with our listeners 3 things that you think are super important for either real estate buyers or real estate brokers or agents or real estate attorneys. 3, or 2, or you can pick the number of things, but things that you think are really important and big takeaways for you if you were going to give them any advice. Thank you, folks, for joining us in another episode of the Blackletter podcast. Ryan Kennedy will be back with us next time to give you his 3 sage pieces of wisdom. That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.